some foods were never created for banquet tables. They were born to the sound of coal carts grinding along narrow rails, in kitchens still wrapped in darkness before sunrise, and quietly traveled with working men into places where daylight existed only as the glow of a lamp fastened to a hard hat. Fairmont, West Virginia, 1927. Deep underground, coal dust drifted through the air like a gray fog. A miner leaned against the rough stone wall after hours of work. He pulled a dented tin lunch pail closer. Its lid was still coated with a fine layer of black dust. The latch clicked open. The scent of grease-stained wax paper and freshly baked bread slipped unexpectedly through the damp smell of earth and coal. Beside it sat nothing more than a bottle of black coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The tin lunch box in the West Virginia mine and the smell of bread amidst coal dust. In many Appalachian homes, people often repeated an old saying, "Waste not, want not." Little was thrown away if it could serve another purpose tomorrow. The 25th dish was the pepperoni roll. The miner carefully peeled back the wax paper and broke the roll in half. The crust had softened after spending hours inside the lunch pail, while the inside still carried the yeasty aroma of fresh bread, streaked with the oil that had slowly melted from the pepperoni into every layer. Around 1927 in Fairmont, a pepperoni roll typically cost between 5 and 10 cents. Italian neighborhood bakeries, including the one owned by Giuseppe Argiro, created this bread specifically for coal miners. It was sturdy enough to ride in a jacket pocket for hours, salty enough for a 10 or 12-hour shift, and compact enough to eat deep inside a mine without needing a plate. The wax paper usually came home marked with small circles of oil. By the next morning, another roll would likely be wrapped the same way and carried back underground. It was lunch. It did its job. Hard years followed across the Appalachian coalfields. In some kitchens, meal folded into wax paper grew smaller, sweeter, and more dependent on whatever flour, apples, or vinegar happened to be waiting on the shelf. Free apples, apple stack cake, vinegar pain, and the sweetness that traveled in a flour sack, Logan County, West Virginia, 1931. The coal company had cut shifts again. Payday came less often, and every trip to the store required careful counting before a single coin left a pocket. A woman stood beside a wooden table beneath a kerosene lamp, spreading flour across a worn board, while 2 apples waited near her elbow. The 24th dish was the fried apple pie. Apples were chopped small, mixed with sugar when sugar was available, then folded into thin rounds of dough before being lowered into hot lard. The pies cooled on brown paper and were often packed into lunch pails before dawn. During the early 1930s, a fried apple pie generally cost between 3 and 6 cents to make, depending on the season and the price of apples. In many mountain communities, the pie traveled as far as the worker who carried it. The smell of apples often lingered in the kitchen long after the pies were gone. The 23rd dish was apple stack cake. Thin cake layers were baked separately, then stacked with cooked apples spread between them. Families sometimes added a new layer whenever ingredients became available, allowing the cake to grow over several days. In parts of Appalachia, a stack cake often appeared at weddings, church gatherings, and community suppers. Even during difficult years, the families tried to save enough flour and apples to make one for special occasions. She sliced it the same way every autumn without measuring a thing. The 22nd dish was vinegar pie. When fresh fruit was scarce, vinegar provided the sharp note that normally came from lemons. Mixed with sugar, eggs, and butter, it produced a filling that could be poured into a pie shell and baked until set. Vinegar pie often cost between 4 and 8 cents to prepare. The ingredients could usually be found in cupboards even when gardens were bare, and store shelves offered little choice. The pie plate rarely returned to the cupboard with a crumb left behind. Outside, another winter settled across the hills. Inside, a few apples, a little flour, and a bottle of vinegar still found their way onto the table, one pie at a time, cornbread, molasses, and the supper that waited on the stove. McDowell County, West Virginia, 1934. Rain tapped against the kitchen window while a woman lifted the lid from a cast-iron skillet warming near the stove. Cornmeal sat in a flour sack beside the table. A crock of molasses rested on a shelf above her head. Supper would be simple, but no one expected anything else. The 21st dish was cornbread and buttermilk. A wedge of cornbread was broken into a bowl, then covered with cool buttermilk. Some families stirred it together with a spoon. Others crumbled the bread first and let it soften before eating. In many Appalachian communities during the 1930s, a serving often cost only 2 to 4 cents. Cornmeal was inexpensive, and buttermilk was commonly available wherever a family kept a cow. The bowl was often rinsed clean before the stove lost its heat. The 20th dish was cornbread with molasses. A thick slice of cornbread was placed on a plate, while a ribbon of dark molasses slowly spread across the surface. It required no extra cooking and little preparation. A serving generally cost between 3 and 5 cents. For many families, it appeared on the table when fresh meat was unavailable or when the week's money had nearly run out. The molasses crock seldom remained unopened for long. The 19th dish was cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was stirred into boiling water until thick, then poured into a pan and left to cool. The next morning, slices could be cut and fried in a skillet until firm along the edges. Depending on the season and the household pantry, a serving usually cost between 2 and 5 cents. The same batch often provided both supper and breakfast. The knife followed the same cutting marks across the pan each morning. The 18th dish was hoe cake. Cornmeal batter was spread onto a hot surface and cooked until set. In earlier generations, some versions were baked on flat metal near an open fire, though by the 1930s most families prepared them on stoves. A hoe cake commonly cost only a few cents. It could be made quickly from ingredients already waiting in the cupboard. Few crumbs remained on the plate by the end of the meal. Outside, rain continued across the coal camps. Inside, the skillet stayed warm a little longer, and cornmeal found another way to become supper. Biscuits, lard, and molasses, the kind of full stomach people couldn't afford to live without. The scent of cornbread faded from the cloth wrapping as the morning wore on. When the cornmeal bin ran low, the shelf beside the stove often held only a sack of flour, a crock of lard, and a jug of molasses darkened by years of use. Eastern Kentucky, 1938. Before sunrise, man sat on the porch tying the worn laces of his work boots. Inside, his wife folded several biscuits into a square of cloth, filled a small jar with molasses, and added a handful of wild onions gathered from the hillside the day before. People often repeated a familiar saying during those years, "Waste not, want not." The 18th dish was cold biscuits with molasses. From around 1880 through 1960, a serving usually cost between 3 and 6 cents. A biscuit was split open and covered with a spoonful of molasses. The syrup settled into every crack before the biscuit was wrapped and carried to the fields, the sawmill, or the coal camp. The jar of molasses rarely stayed full for long. The 17th dish was lard biscuits. From about 1890 through 1940, each biscuit cost only 2 to 4 cents. Lard was worked into flour by hand before the dough was shaped and baked. One or two biscuits often became part of a workday lunch because they traveled well and required little preparation. She no longer needed to measure the ingredients. The 16th dish was wild onions with biscuits. Dating back to the 18th century, this meal cost roughly 1 to 3 cents because the onions were gathered from nearby hillsides, while the biscuits were already waiting in the kitchen. Onions were cleaned and chopped before being eaten beside the bread or cooked briefly in a little rendered fat. The smell of spring soil lingered on the cutting board after they were gone. Outside, daylight slowly reached the hills. Inside, the biscuit cloth was folded again and returned to its place beside the flour sack, waiting for another morning. Pinto beans, dried green beans, the meals that stayed on the stove. As spring moved across the hills and the last wild onions disappeared from the table, the pot on the stove returned to its familiar place. Beans soaked overnight in cool water, while the rest of the house settled into darkness. West Virginia, 1941. Before sunrise, a woman lifted the lid from a pot that had been simmering since early morning. Steam drifted into the kitchen. A glass jar waited beside the stove, along with a folded sheet of newspaper that would help hold the heat a little longer on the road to work. The 15th dish was stewed beans in a glass jar. From around 1900 through 1950, a serving usually cost between 5 and 8 cents. The beans were sorted by hand, soaked overnight, and cooked slowly with onions, salt, pepper, and a small amount of pork fat when one was available. Before leaving for work, the hot beans were ladled into a jar and sealed tightly. By midday, the worker unscrewed the lid and ate directly from the jar with a spoon carried in a pocket or lunch pail. The jar usually came home with little more than a trace of broth at the bottom. The 14th dish was the bean sandwich. From 1900 through 1960, each sandwich generally cost between 4 and 7 cents. Leftover beans from supper were mashed with a fork and spread between slices of bread. The filling softened the bread as the morning passed, creating a lunch that required no reheating and no extra utensils. For many families, one pot of beans rarely ended with a single meal. The wax paper was often folded around the same sandwich before dawn. The 13th dish was leather breeches, a mountain name for strings of green beans hung from rafters to dry. The practice dated back to the 18th century and allowed summer gardens to feed families long after the harvest had ended. The serving usually cost only 1 or 2 cents because most of the ingredients came directly from the garden. The beans were threaded onto string, hung for weeks, then stored until winter arrived. Snow covered the hillsides. They were soaked, cooked, and served beside bread or cornbread. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." Their breeches reflected that habit as clearly as any meal on the mountain table. The strings hung above the kitchen long after the garden was gone. Outside, another season moved across the hills. Inside, the bean pot remained close to the stove, ready to become tomorrow's supper as easily as today's. Salt, vinegar, and cured meat, lunches that needed no refrigeration. Eventually, even the bean pot grew lighter. The shelves in many Appalachian kitchens remained lined with glass jars. Inside were foods prepared weeks or months earlier, waiting for the next workday to arrive. West Virginia, 1939. Deep underground, a miner sat beside a narrow rail track when the lunch whistle echoed through the tunnel. He pulled a dented lunch pail closer and lifted the lid. Inside sat 2 pickled eggs beside a wedge of cornbread wrapped in paper. The meal looked much the same as it had when it left the kitchen before sunrise. The 12th dish was pickled eggs with cornbread. From around 1880 through 1960, a meal of 2 eggs and a slice of cornbread usually cost between 6 and 10 cents. The eggs were boiled, peeled, and placed into jars filled with salted vinegar. After several days, they were ready to be packed into lunch pails, picnic baskets, or work sacks. Workers often broke pieces of cornbread between bites, using the bread to balance the sharpness of the vinegar. The jar usually waited on the same shelf till another batch was needed. The 11th dish was the country ham sandwich. From roughly 1870 through 1940, each sandwich generally cost between 8 and 15 cents. Thin slices of country ham were placed between thick pieces of bread and wrapped in wax paper before the workday began. Because the ham had already been cured, traveled well, and required no refrigeration during the hours between sunrise and lunch. The wax paper often carried the scent of smoke long after the sandwich was gone. The 10th dish was the salt pork sandwich. From around 1850 through 1930, each one usually cost between 6 and 12 cents. A piece of salt pork was lifted from the brine barrel, sliced thin, and cooked in a cast iron skillet before being tucked inside bread. The skillet remained useful long after the cooking was finished. Little of the rendered fat was discarded, and what remained often found its way into another meal later in the week. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Waste not, want not." Few kitchens followed that advice more carefully than the mountain kitchens of Appalachia. The brine barrel stood in its corner year after year. Outside, the garden rows were already beginning to fill with another season's vegetables. Inside, the preserving jars remained lined along the shelf, ready to supply one more lunch before the next harvest arrived. Greens, green tomatoes, and the art of wasting nothing. The jars of vinegar and cured meat had carried many kitchens through the colder months. By late summer and early autumn, attention shifted once again to the garden behind the house, where every remaining vegetable mattered. Tennessee, late September 1942. A light frost rested across the hills before sunrise. Green tomatoes still hung from their vines, but everyone knew the season was nearly over. A woman carried a woven basket into the garden and picked what remained before another cold night arrived. Back in the kitchen, she laid the tomatoes across a worn wooden table and sliced them into thick rounds. Cornmeal waited in a bowl beside the stove, along with a small container of bacon grease saved from an earlier meal. The 9th dish was fried green tomatoes. From around 1890 onward, a serving usually cost only 3 to 6 cents. The tomatoes came from the garden, the cornmeal was inexpensive, the bacon grease had already been saved for another use. Each slice was coated and placed into the skillet before being turned by hand as it cooked. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without." Few meals reflected that habit more clearly. The first frost usually arrived only a few days later. The 8th dish was the fried green tomato sandwich. From the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, each sandwich generally cost between 6 and 10 cents. Cooled slice of fried green tomato was placed between 2 slices of bread and wrapped in wax paper before the workday began. By noon, the sandwich carried with it the memory of a garden that had only recently been harvested. The wax paper was folded around the same lunch a little differently each morning. The 7th dish was wilted lettuce salad. From around 1880 through 1950, each serving usually cost between 4 and 8 cents. Fresh lettuce was washed, dried, and covered with warm bacon drippings mixed with vinegar and a little pepper. Leaves softened almost immediately after the dressing was added. In many mountain homes, the salad appeared beside beans, cornbread, or salt pork already sitting on the table. The wooden bowl often returned to the shelf before sunset. Outside, the growing season was drawing to a close. Inside, the garden still supplied one more meal before autumn finally settled across the hills. Canned fish, creek fish, and the rare praten in a lunch pail. Some days brought a meal that appeared less often than beans or cornbread. A can of fish from the store or a catch from a nearby creek could change the contents of a lunch pail for a day or two. Appalachia, 1948. Near sunset, a man returned from the creek, carrying several fish on a length of string. Water still dripped onto the porch boards as he stepped inside. In the kitchen, a cast iron skillet waited on the stove, while a bowl of cornmeal sat beside it. The evening meal would be different from the one served the day before. The 6th dish was salmon patties. From about 1920 through 1960, a can of salmon usually cost between 15 and 25 cents, making each serving roughly 8 to 12 cents. Salmon was emptied into a bowl and mixed with crumbled cornbread, chopped onion, and an egg when one was available. The soft bones were mashed into the mixture before it was shaped into patties and placed in a hot skillet. Nothing from the can was wasted. The liquid was often saved and used elsewhere in the meal. One can still had to reach every plate at the table. The fifth dish was fried catfish with corn fritters. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, a meal like this generally cost the equivalent of 10 to 18 cents when the fish came from a local creek or river. The catfish was cleaned, coated with cornmeal, and cooked in a cast iron skillet. Afterward, the remaining batter was used to make small corn fritters in the same pan. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Waste not, want not." The skillet usually cooked more than one thing before the fire burned low. The children gathered a little closer whenever fish appeared on the table. The fourth dish was turtle soup with cornbread. During the early and middle decades of the 20th century, a pot of turtle soup usually cost between 15 and 25 cents when the turtle had been caught locally. The meat was simmered with onions, potatoes, and carrots for several hours before being served in bowls beside thick slices of cornbread. Meals like this appeared less often than beans, cornbread, or garden vegetables, which made them stand out in memory long after the season had passed. The cornbread disappeared from the basket before the pot was empty. Outside, the creek continued moving through the hills. Inside, the skillet cooled on the stove while the last dishes were washed and returned to the cupboard. Wild game. When the forest became a family second pantry, West Virginia, late winter, 1932. The snow still lingered beneath the oak trees, while the hills remained quiet before sunrise. A man pulled on a wool coat, picked up a worn rifle, and stepped into the woods beyond the house. Behind him, smoke drifted from the chimney into the cold morning air. For many Appalachian families, the forest provided food when gardens were empty and pantry shelves were growing bare. Its hunting was woven into the rhythm of daily life, long before supermarkets reached the mountain communities. The third dish was groundhog stew. Throughout the early and middle decades of the 20th century, a pot large enough to feed a family usually cost between 10 and 20 cents for potatoes, carrots, turnips, and seasonings. The meat came from the day's hunt. It was soaked, cleaned, browned in a skillet, then simmered with vegetables for several hours. The stew remained on the stove through much of the afternoon, while cornbread baked nearby. The lid was lifted often, but the pot stayed where it was until supper. The second dish was opossum with sweet potatoes. During late autumn and early winter, a meal like this generally cost between 20 and 35 cents when sweet potatoes, molasses, and seasonings were included. Meat was placed in a roasting pan and surrounded with sweet potatoes before being cooked slowly over several hours. The sweet potatoes absorbed the drippings as they cooked beside the meat, making use of every part of the meal. The roasting pan rarely returned to the shelf with much left inside. The first dish was squirrel and dumplings. From the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, a pot usually cost between 10 and 18 cents for flour, salt, and a little cooking fat. Squirrel meat simmered in broth, while small pieces of dough were dropped into the pot one by one. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." But few meals reflected that habit more clearly. The wooden spoon rested across the pot until the last bowl was filled. Outside, winter still covered parts of the hillside. Inside, the stove remained warm. The dishes were washed, and the rifle returned to its place by the door until it was needed again. The lunch pail closed, but the kitchen remained. The tin lunch pail closed with the same familiar click heard thousands of times before. The corner remained dented from years of use. A few crumbs of cornbread rested near the bottom. The glass jar that once held pickled eggs still carried the faint scent of vinegar around its lid. A dark stain of sorghum molasses marked one corner of the wax paper folded inside. Wise County, Virginia, 1952. Evening settled across the hills as the last dishes were washed and placed back into the cupboard. The stove still held a few glowing embers. Tomorrow's lunch had not been packed yet, but many of its ingredients were already waiting on the shelf. From around 1880 through 1960, meals like these traveled into coal mines, sawmills, tobacco fields, railroad camps, and small schools scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Some cost only a few cents. Others required a little more money or a fortunate catch from a nearby creek. Each one was shaped by whatever happened to be available that day. A pepperoni roll rested in a lunch pail beside a bottle of coffee. A slice of fried apple pie cooled on brown paper near the window. Cornbread softened in a bowl of buttermilk. A biscuit carried a streak of sorghum molasses across its surface. A jar of beans still held warmth from the morning fire. A pickled egg waited beside a wedge of bread. Green tomatoes were gathered before frost reached the garden. A can of salmon was divided carefully across the table. Fish from a nearby creek shared space with corn fritters in the same skillet. Dumplings floated beside small pieces of squirrel meat in a pot that remained on the stove until supper. People often repeated a familiar saying, "Waste not, want not." Few kitchens followed those words more faithfully. The lunch pail stood ready beside the door before sunrise arrived again. The same dent remained in the metal. The same shelf still held a jar, a sack of flour, and a folded piece of wax paper. Outside, darkness settled over the hills. Inside, the last ember faded beneath the stove lid. The dishes rested quietly in the cupboard. Another workday drew to a close. Nothing about these lunches was extraordinary. That's exactly why they mattered. The lunch pail stood ready beside the door before sunrise arrived again. The same dent remained in the metal. The same shelf still held a jar, a sack of flour, and a folded piece of paper. If these old kitchens remind you of someone you once knew, share their memory below. And if you enjoy stories from forgotten American tables, join us again here at Old American Kitchen.